Boom, 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 literature gets a look. Legs talk about books. Hello and welcome to another episode of Legs Talk About Books, the monthly literature podcast where we talk about books. I'm your host, Hardleg Joe. Joining me today, a face you may remember, or a voice you may remember, Mr. Bootleg Drew.
Hello.
How's it feel to be back here again?
Very good.
Yes. And for this episode, we're actually doing a graphic novel for the month of December. We thought with all the holidays, we would make it easy for you to read everything. And we decided to do MAUS by Art Spiegelman. This is probably one of the greatest graphic novels ever written.
Yeah, I'd agree with that statement.
Yeah, I'd have to say it up there. One of the few non-fiction graphic novels that I know of.
That also have like a fictional kind of aesthetic to them.
Yeah, somewhat. I'm not sure if I told you about this, but this is an interesting thing to bring up right at the start. When this came out, Time magazine actually awarded it, like, Best Fiction of the Year. And there's, like, a big hubbub because they're like, how could you award this Best Fiction? It's clearly, like, a biography about a guy. But if you're unfamiliar with MAUS, maybe, I'm not sure what I used for the title, he depicts all the people as anthropomorphic animals, even though they're real people. Mm-hmm. So Time's response was, yeah, sure, this is non-fiction. Let's go and knock on Art Spiegelman's house, and if a mouse answers, then we'll put him into non-fiction.
Wow.
Like, what assholes?
Yeah, Time is, yeah, we could go on a whole different podcast on how Time's not a great magazine.
But I mean, that just kind of goes to show you the viewpoint that people had. Like, they were so unused to comics being treated as anything but superhero comics. And to this day, they still kind of aren't. Like,
I was about to say, Watchmen would be the second best after this.
Yeah,
and that's like
still a
the
superhero
iconic,
comic.
yeah.
But even then, you still have, like, obviously there's a lot of fantasy, but things like Fables, Why the Last Man. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of that.
I have.
Yeah, there's a couple other comics. Comics have definitely gotten a little bit more serious, but there's still never been anything quite like this, at least that I know of. I know they're more like independent comics, but nothing that reached the widespread success of MAUS. Because you actually read this in school, didn't you?
Yeah, we had to read this in school, and then I read Night and a couple other books as like a interest after that.
Yeah. And if you don't know, if you couldn't tell, MAUS is actually about the Holocaust, or it's about a survivor of the Holocaust. I'd say it's more like the biography of a man who just happened to survive the Holocaust
Than it is about the Holocaust itself. Yeah,
because there's two parts, and the whole first, they don't even get to like Auschwitz until the second part. The first part is more like a slice of life, almost, of what it was like to live in like 1940s Poland.
Yeah.
Which does a really good job of setting that up. We'll get to it in a moment, but before we get to talking about the themes and the interesting things we liked about this book, just a short review. What do you think about this book? Would you recommend it?
I would highly recommend reading this book, or at least even if you're not going to fully read parts, 1 and 2, at least give part 1 a try, because it's just, again, like you said, it's such an interesting slice of life, and like teaches you the slow degrade of the Jewish people at that time and the changing in the Nazi establishment. It's an interesting way to look at history.
Yeah, even without the historical thing about this, like, something about the way it's presented, or something about Vladek's life. Vladek is the guy that this is written about. It's just very compelling. It's really interesting to see, like, what happens next. And it's got a really interesting framing device, too. Like, it's not a straightforward biography. It's told from the perspective of his son, who is writing the biography. So there's interspliced moments of, like, him talking to his dad and an old man, and then flashing back to what the story he's telling and everything like that. So just really interesting, really compelling. One of the few times I would be like, this is a must-read. This is like a 10 out of 10. Like you said, you've read several other stories about the Holocaust.
And I don't remember them as well as I remember MAUS.
Yeah, I feel like this is probably one of the best stories about it, just to sort of get the whole picture of it, to sort of get the whole idea of that. So yeah, and from here on in, we're talking spoilers, although it's always weird to say spoilers when you're talking about a real event.
Yeah.
Like, spoilers, World War II happened, there was a Holocaust, it was really awful.
Yeah.
And I guess, like, from the very beginning of this, you know that he survives, because that's literally why he's telling the story.
Yeah.
If he didn't survive, this wouldn't exist. And the first talking point we have here is actually one that was given by an audience member, Chris W., who you may know if you're a fan of my Yu-Gi-Oh! Channel. He sends me a bunch of stuff, like Japanese cards and stuff. Great guy. Yes, what do you think of graphic novels in general? And do you think there are any strengths and weaknesses to using a graphic novel to discuss something as serious as the Holocaust? And I'll throw it over to you since I had my stuff written down.
Yeah, I was about to say, that's an awesome question just
Yeah.
to start it off. But no, I think the best part about using a graphic novel to discuss something as serious as this is that you can capture the visceral nature of what you're talking about, the tones, the themes, as you were, without having to describe every painful detail and put yourself in there. You can, like, almost like you're looking into a window of history.
Yeah. I think that's kind of, like, if you watch a movie about the Holocaust, it can be, like, such a heart-wrenching thing. And in some ways it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Like, you're supposed to learn that. But it can be almost, like, so overwhelming to see such horribleness that you almost, like, block it out. That you almost just sort of, like, forget about it, or you try to move past it. Your brain doesn't want to dwell on it. But because these are still images, it's sort of, like, removed enough from reality that you don't feel like this horrible sinking pit in your stomach. Like, you're not listening to the screams of people. I think that's another thing, the lack of sound. But you still remember it. It's still very memorable. So it hits that perfect, like, sweet spot of, like, I know this is horrible, but it's not, like, making my heart want to die. Like,
And I think that's the strength. The only weakness is, again, I think, you lose some impact to the benefit of the medium, but I think you can lose either, again, with the art style or the lack of other immersive qualities. It just becomes just
yeah, you're always kind
lackluster.
you're always kind of aware that you're reading a comic book. It's not like a movie where you can kind of, like, lose yourself in the narrative.
Yeah.
But, yeah, again, I think that kind of helps, and it's kind of set up with that, because you're reminded from the very start that this is a story being told by someone else. Like, they set up the whole idea of that. It's really interesting. One thing I didn't think about when I was thinking about this earlier is just sort of, like, the impact that music has on things. And I'm wondering, because I've seen a couple, like, movies about the Holocaust, like Schindler's List, Escape from Sobibor. I think that's how you say it. I'm not sure if you've seen any of those.
I've seen Schindler's List. I've not seen the second one.
Yeah, the second one, that's, like, almost... The first half of it is just, like, horrible, and then the second half is, like, an action movie as they plan their escape.
Ah, gotcha.
It's one of these smaller concentration camps, but it was one of the few where, like, they killed the guards and, like, a bunch of people, like, ran out the gates.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they actually, like, escaped. It's one of those things, the more I look into movies after reading books, the more I realize, like, you'll see an emotional scene, and people will be like, oh, that really touched me, but without the music, it's like nothing.
Right.
I think a great example, not even like a movie, but like a game,
Yeah.
Undertale. Like, Undertale, I think the music sells that more than anything.
Yeah.
Like, the final confrontation, which I guess I won't spoil here for
Right.
the few of you who haven't played it, but the final conversation of the like, pure pacifist run, I didn't really understand exactly what was going on. I didn't know the context of the
Right.
characters, but the song Hopes and Dreams
Yeah.
just sells it so hard. Music is sort of underrated in how impactful it is in things, and when you take it out in comics, you kind of have to rely just on the narrative, and I think it both, like, makes it sort of less impactful, but again, in this case, it's kind of a good thing.
Yeah.
The fact that, like, that music isn't there to, like, tear my heart out and make me cry is the thing that allows me to, like, read through this with a more objective, like, look at it.
Yeah.
Maybe not objective. I don't know, it's really hard to explain, because it's like, you get really invested in the characters, but there's never a point in this where I'm, like, super depressed about it.
Yeah.
I don't know how to explain it, or how it manages to do that, but it does it really well. One other thing I wrote down, and I completely forgot about this, but this is another really interesting advantage of comic books in general.
Right.
Just the fact that you can have narration over visuals, which, like, you can do that in film, but you can't have it be constant. Normally it's like, the narrator will start a scene, and then you'll go through the scene, and then maybe they'll, like, end it. But you couldn't have a whole movie where it was just a guy narrating what was happening to him.
Right. It would feel silly.
Yeah.
Or, like, even a stage production couldn't do that without feeling kind of campy.
Yeah. Or another thing that comics can do really well is, like, you can have a scene with people talking in it and narration.
Yeah.
You can't do that in a film because you wouldn't be able to hear the multiple things.
The way it flows just, lets it...
Or, like, you can show, like, a big room with 8 people talking and, like, read each one of their individual things.
And get a feel for that room.
Yeah, in a way that, like, if you were watching a movie where you're, like, having to listen, like, maybe you miss a thing or two, or maybe you can't hear it all too well.
You get, like, these little blurbs, but, like, and the quick cuts make it feel faster paced than it naturally would be.
Yeah, it has the comics in general. I'm a really big big fan of because it has all the advantages of like books and movies kind of combined. You can see exactly what you're looking at, but unlike a movie where you're dragged along at 60 frames per second and you can miss things, just like with a book, you can always go back and reread. You could take time to absorb all the little details that have there.
So one thing about comics, and I know the audience wouldn't be able to see this, but I just wanted to pull out just any page here. The use of like soft space in between the panels is also really nicely done in this book. Like a lot of comics, especially modern comics, feels like they have to like blurb each like panel together or like make them really weird spacing, but this always has nice even spacing between the lines, and if they don't, it's for a reason.
Yeah, it actually uses like every element. It's weird, like the panels, the shape of the panels and everything is something that most people think of as an afterthought, but in MAUS it's very deliberate. Like they specifically wanted to make it very easy to read. A lot of parts of it where there's conversations are book-like. And then there's other parts where, like, for emphasis, something is bigger, something is looming over the other pages.
Right.
Or something, if something blurs into one panel to another, it's because it's a series of events or something like that.
Exactly.
And that's the same thing, like, for December going on, assuming we're still doing this next year, like, December is graphic novel month, because it's easier to finish a graphic novel than a regular novel.
That makes sense,
yeah.
too. Yeah.
And if we do Watchmen, that's another great example, like, why that's one of the best comics, even though it's a superhero one, is just how much detail he put into it.
Oh my gosh, and just like, the narrative tale he can tell with it.
But even just on a mechanical standpoint, because one of the things, Alan Moore, who wrote Watchmen, actually released the script he wrote, and it's not just like, panel 1, do this, like, he writes like a page for each panel, and he's like, the panel should be shaped like this, it should take up this much of the screen, there should be like a gum wrapper in the background that has this on it, because this is what would be there in that world. And this is like what that logo looks like. He goes so in depth into every single image and why it has to be there. And like there's stuff where like panels mirror other panels across the entirety of like the thing, and just all these little details. And it's like, you don't see that kind of craft. Most comics now, most like superhero comics and stuff, they're just like, I want to tell a movie, but I don't have a movie, so I'm just going to use the panels like a camera.
I was about to say, even Kingdom Come has that kind of problem, too, but that's not what we're here to talk about.
Yeah. But we just got, it's fun to talk about comics on one of the few chances we have to read comics. Because I mostly want this to be about books. I don't want to get stuck into like, let's do One Piece and 300 chapters of that.
Oh god, that would be terrible.
I keep hearing, it's like, man, One Piece gets good after chapter 365.
It gets really good after 365, but you know, that's not the point.
But yeah, moving past the topic of comics in general, I think the first point I had on here, which is what I wrote down reading the first half of this, is I'm astonished by how relatable Vladek's story is at the beginning. Like, there's always been this sense to me when you're reading a story about the past, or even like watching a black and white movie, that like, our grandparents or great-grandparents lived in a very different society. Like, things were just, like, vastly different. And when you read about Vladek's life, it's just like, no, he's just, like, the same as we are now, just with, like, slight differences.
He's just like a dude living in the times.
Yeah, it's like, he's got his apartment, he's got his girlfriend, he goes out, he talks to his friends, he sees, maybe not movies or whatever. No, he goes to see, like, a show at some point. And he even talks of, like, he gets this girl that he's dating, and he's like, I didn't really like her all that much, but she was really hot, essentially. He doesn't say it in so many words. And then he meets someone really nice, and he has to break it off with her, and she's really clingy, and she, like, writes a note to the girl he's dating to say he's like, oh, he's a really bad guy, I don't trust him, he's a liar, and he has a million girlfriends.
Right.
And I'm like, this is, like, exactly the same kind of shit that still happens today, where, like, your ex texts your modern girlfriend to say all these bad rumors about you and stuff.
I mean, it's all being human. It's all the human conditioning and experience.
It's just a very human story. And it's funny, too, because at the end of that section, he's like, but don't include this in your comic book. And Art's like, but why? This is great. It does things. He's like, no, it wouldn't be proper. And I just sort of had this realization, like, so that's why it seems that way.
Yeah, it's because people wanted it to seem like more responsible than it was to teach the current generation.
Yeah. And it's one of those, like, very, very short story from my own, like, I didn't find out until I was, like, 20 that, like, my grandfather was actually my grandma's second husband. Like, she had been married before and got a divorce, and I had like this whole other section of family that I'm like partially related to.
Right.
But like my family, like she would never mention that. She would be like, "Oh, this is like a big family secret that we got divorced." Because, like, I guess back then you just didn't talk about it or something.
No, it was just like it wasn't a thing, yeah.
Yeah, but it's just this idea, like, she had as a messy life as any of the people now.
Yeah.
We just didn't think about it because she didn't mention it.
Well, yeah, because you'd be, like, shamed, or it'd be like, again, like, my grandma got kicked out of, like, a church when she got divorced. Oof. And, like, yeah, and, like, it was her whole, like, you know, community basically, like, ostracized her for basically being, you know, kind of more free-willed than the rest of the people. So, like, it's just like one of those things, like, there was some slight differences in how the reaction got. It wasn't as normalized, but it still happened. Like, people lived their lives.
Well, and that's the thing, like, you get ostracized, but, like, she still survived her family. Like, it wasn't like she had to, like, move to another country and start over or whatever.
Exactly.
It's just sort of like, you know, people got upset about it, but then they went about their way. It's the same. I one of my grandma's brothers just, like, very obviously very gay.
Right.
Like, super, super, like, flamboyantly gay. And it was one of those things like, yeah, you couldn't talk about it, but everyone knew.
Yeah.
And no one, like, treated him badly about it. At least no one in the family did. They were just sort of like, you know, Uncle Jimmy, he's a little fruity.
Yeah.
Like, whatever. Let him do what he wants to do.
Right. They weren't as, you know, open as like, hey, how's your boyfriend? But, like, you know, they weren't as defiant about him.
He would bring his friend to Christmas, and he'd just be like, oh, this is my good buddy. We hang out from time to time.
Yeah.
And everyone kind of knew, but, like, the kids were just like, oh, hey, Uncle Jimmy's friend.
Yeah,
like,
hey, Uncle
how's
Jimmy.
It going?
Because, like, again, that's my favorite thing about kids, is that they just, like, you tell them one thing, they're just like, all right, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're too busy worrying about, like, Transformers and stuff.
They don't have time to worry about, like,
adult things.
All sorts of adult things.
Anyway.
But yeah, just his story is very, very relatable. He's got some very serious flaws, and even those come out, like, more and more as you go. But I think the great thing about how relatable it is, that sort of goes back with the themes, is the fact that there so many sort of like Holocaust stories, or just not even Holocaust stories, just stories about tragedies.
Stories about victims in general.
Any story about like a victim of someone, they always try to make the victim seem as like pure and innocent and nice as possible, as sort of a way to like basically work around people who would blame the victim.
Right.
To be like, you deserve that or whatever. Which is completely, you know, I'm not saying, like, anyone does. That's the thing, is, like, he's such an asshole, and not even he deserved this.
Yeah, no.
Like, no one deserved this.
No.
They were still, like, completely and utterly, but because they show him as being this realistic, flawed person, because they show him as, like, this asshole grandpa that, like, I've met that guy.
Yeah.
It makes it have so much weight, it seems so much more realistic.
Well, because, like, again, like, one of the biggest tragedies besides the death and destruction was the dehumanization that the Jewish people went through in that time period, where they weren't given rights and, like, abilities like other people were. And so to be, like, even in history, when you're on the good side of history, thinking, like, oh, these poor, you know, innocent, you start using words to describe something you would describe a cat in a shelter.
Yeah.
Versus, like,
actual people.
Versus like Vladik, who's just a dude who went through the worst event in human history.
You know, it's interesting the way you brought that up, because I never thought of it before. Like, it's dehumanizing, but it's like positive dehumanization.
Yeah,
it's sort of like a positive stereotype.
Yeah,
and people talk about like the stereotype that like Asians are good at math, and they're like, that's still a bad thing.
Yeah,
because it still sets them apart as like, because of who they are, they should be this.
Yes, exactly.
When really they're individual people. Everyone's going to be different.
Yes.
And it's the same thing when you tell a story about a tragedy. There's this thing to dehumanize them and make them into, like, perfect angels who were completely destroyed by, like, the big evil Germans.
Right.
And it's not. It's more complicated than that.
But
and I think that's kind of what makes this so great.
But I want to, again, heavily emphasize Hardleg Gaming condemns.
Yeah, we completely condemn the Holocaust.
Yeah, as, like, the worst human event.
And that's one of the things that's, like, he even gets to this in the story where he worries that he's like, Vladik is, like, the stereotypical greedy Jew. Like, he's always worried about getting money and stuff like that. He's like, I'm worried about representing him like that, because it almost feels like fodder for the people who want to be, like, anti-Semitic.
Right.
But it's like, you know, if you're not anti-Semitic, it just makes him come off as more relatable.
Yeah,
at least
he's
to me.
A normal dude.
Yeah. So but I do kind of get that sort of back and forth. Like, I do want to say the Holocaust was a tragedy. No one deserved it, but at the same time, they were still people. They were people with flaws and problems and all sorts of different things.
Yeah, it's again, I was really excited when you brought up that this would be the subject matter, because like it's the most real thing we've tackled on this like program.
Yeah.
Which is very fun because we don't get to dance around some of the things, but again, I want to make sure that people are clear on our stance 'cause internet.
Yeah. Nazi scum, go home. We don't want you here. Okay, so moving gears, switching gears to one of the more interesting things, which is something like I didn't even think of as a problem until I was looking up the reaction to this.
Right.
Because I decided to actually do some research.
Right.
Because I finished this in like a week.
As we should.
Yeah, I think MBT was reading this. He was a former co-host.
Oh, okay.
And he's like, yeah, I read this in 2 hours. Like, this is a pretty easy read compared to a lot of the other stuff. But I was looking up stuff, and they said a lot of people were upset that he chose anthropomorphic animals for things. And if you're unfamiliar with the book, just really briefly, like, all the Jews are depicted as mice, all the Germans are cats, all the Americans are dogs, and all the Polish are pigs. And to me, that just sort of seemed like, it's adding theming to the story. It's adding an artistic touch to the story.
At first glance.
Yeah. To sort of show, I guess, kind of like we were talking about before, the Jews were the prey.
Yeah,
in
they're
this
the natural
example.
prey of the German.
Yeah, they're still
soldiers.
they're being put upon.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people who took a lot of issue with this, where they're like, by making the Jews a different species, you're sort of reinforcing this idea that they're fundamentally different from the cats, that they're like incompatible. And by doing stuff like making the Polish pigs, they're like, that doesn't really reinforce the thing, that just sort of insults Poles.
Yeah.
Although we were talking about this as we were walking.
Yeah.
Because I was like, they should have made them some other barnyard animal. I think the point to make them pigs wasn't to be like, they're pig-like. I think it was to be like, they're a third animal that is uninvolved with the cat-mouse dynamic.
Right. I suggested sheep because I think that's, again, like, if he's going across the theme of, like, these are the prey, these are the animals, and then these are the hunters, and then these are the bystanders.
Yeah.
That sheep are very known for being, sheep. They follow, they listen, they're bystanders.
Yeah. But it's one of those things where, like, we were going through all the barnyard animals, and we're like, no matter what you do, you're going to be insulted.
Yeah.
Like, at least pigs are delicious. But if you're a sheep, then they're like, oh, the Poles were just mindless followers.
Yeah.
And if you're a chicken, then the Poles were cowards.
Yeah.
If you try to do a cow, like, cows are big and dumb, and I guess they're also delicious.
Yeah.
Maybe a cow would have been better.
Kind of, maybe. I don't really think it's, again, like you said, it's not really good in any way you slice it.
Yeah, any way you slice it. And, again, it's kind of weird, too, because all the Americans are dogs.
They're good boys.
Yeah, they're such good puppers. They're good American puppers coming and chasing out those cats. But the interesting thing about it is that, like, despite the Jews being sort of like this separate, like, race almost, in America, they're like, they're black dogs and white dogs, where they're like, it doesn't matter what color your skin is, you're still a dog.
Yeah.
It sort of, like, downplays the race aspect while also, like, upplaying it in Germany. So it's not, like, a consistent thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost, I think he almost does that on purpose, again, because racism was such a hot issue in that time, well, not just in that time period, but, like, specifically in that point in time for those specific groups of people.
Yeah.
Racism and imagery was a part of what they experienced.
Yeah.
So to naturally depict that, I think, is the appropriate choice. Well, again, some people might not like it. I think he did do the right choice for imagery.
Yeah, I can go either way. Again, I can definitely see the point. I can understand. I was thinking last night, like, if I was Polish, what would I think about this?
Yeah.
And I'd be like, I'm kind of upset that I have to be a pig. I don't want to be a pig. Like, there were Poles that helped and stuff. But, that's the thing. That's just kind of the framing device he went with. I think the way he explained it in the interview, and this is not an exact quote or anything, but this is just sort of the gist, was that he's like, in a lot of Nazi propaganda, the Jews were depicted as, like, vermin and mice. Mm-hmm. There's actually a quote in here somewhere, I believe, talking about how, like, Mickey Mouse is some sort of, like, only a Jew would make a mouse into a hero or something like that. So he's like, I wanted to lean into that, but also show, like, I can depict them as vermin, and they'll still be sympathetic.
Which he did.
Yeah.
Very well.
Very, very well. Like, even though everyone's depicted as a mouse, you still empathize with them a whole lot. And it's just this idea that, like, even if your propaganda was right, we still didn't deserve this.
Like, again, like, it's one of those, even if you're right, you're somehow wrong in this situation.
Yeah. And then it's also, he didn't say this, but I was like, this is my theory, because if you look at the other stuff that he's made, he's really big into, like, experimental underground comics.
Yeah.
Part of me thinks that, like, he's like, I'm gonna tell a serious story, and I'm gonna include cartoon animals, and it's still gonna win awards.
And, you know, kudos to him for doing it.
I don't think he ever admitted that, but I kind of have a feeling that's a theory. He just wanted to, like, I want to make anthropomorphic animals, like, an acceptable thing by telling, like, one of the most serious stories with them.
And I mean, again, he kind of did it. So I can't really blame the guy, even if that was his motive.
Yep. One other thing I wanted to bring up real quickly about that, I really liked the few moments where, like, the framing device almost fell apart. There's the one thing where they're in the concentration camp, and there's the guy who, like, he's in there with the Jews, and every day he's like, I'm a German, let me out of here, I'm not Jewish.
Oh, yeah.
And he's like, was he a German? Like, I don't know, he could have just been making up stuff, and he, like, sort of shows him, like, morphing between a cat and a mouse.
Yeah.
And they're like, is he a cat forced to wear a mouse mask, or is he just a mouse pretending to be a cat?
To get out, yeah. And that's the thing, though. Because of that racism, because of the way the propaganda worked in that time period, the German people who were also Jewish were like, yeah, he could have been like a prominent member of the German council, but he was also Jewish, so he had to go.
Yeah.
Like, it was really weird.
Points like that also kind of point out the whole thing that, like, the fact that that you couldn't know points out how silly it is to, like, divide them into this and this. So, another thing that I wanted to bring up with this, animals aside, is, just sort of like the overall tone of this book. Because again, it's like, it is a Holocaust story. It is grim. And yet, every time I read this, no matter how bleak it is, I always come away from it feeling, like, hopeful. Like, it has an overall positive tone. It literally ends with, like, Vladek's gravestone there, and yet it's so happy.
And that's because unlike Night, where it's, again, like we talked about this, unlike Night, where it's a story of a man who was dehumanized, and it ends with his realization of how dehumanized he's become, where the last sentence is about him becoming a skeleton.
Yeah.
This story is about a survivor. That was the important part, is that you can survive, you can make a family, you can continue to have the things you want despite what happens in history.
And I think that's, again, part of the genius of the framing device is, like, you know, if you had told this just, like, starting with his perspective and gone through everything where you weren't sure if he would survive, it would just be, it would be dark, it would be depressing.
It'd be stressful.
I wouldn't enjoy the story. But because it's, like, his son living in America, and, like, halfway through he has a daughter of his own, it's like, it is continuing, like, he has kept it through.
Yeah.
No matter what happens to him, there's always the sense that, but he won.
Which is just, it's just nice. It's nice to have that, the people like the Elie Wiesel ending where, you know, they kind of like, yes, that was a chapter, but it wasn't the full story.
Yeah. I think that's what we should talk real quick. If you're not familiar with Elie Wiesel's Night, that is another really major book about the Holocaust.
That you should read.
That is one, like, that's what, in my school, they had us read that. That was, like, basically our Holocaust book.
Right.
You read MAUS, we read Night. And Night is I don't remember that much about it, and I think it's because I just remember it being so grim, because it starts with him getting captured, the entire book is just him in a concentration camp, and just bad thing after bad thing happens to him, and then at the end he escapes. I think everyone escapes, or like the camp gets shut down or something. I don't even remember.
The soldiers come in. It's very similar to how MAUS ends.
Yeah, they like march them out of the camp, and then the soldiers just sort of abandon them.
Yeah,
and then they find their way to like an American camp.
Yeah.
And I just remember like the last line is just he goes and he looks in a mirror and he sees himself and he doesn't recognize himself at first because he looks like a skeleton because he's just so like gout and he's been so like abused and everything like that. And all that comes away with saying is just like, this horrible thing happened and it was horrible.
Yeah, and I was just like, again, you feel horrible, and that's the point of the book, and I did a good job getting across its point, but like...
It just doesn't have the impact of like a full story has. It just almost feels as exploitative as something like Saw or whatever.
Yeah.
Obviously, it was meant for a better purpose than that.
Right.
But it just doesn't hold as much weight with me as something like MAUS does.
Right. And again, not to degrade
Elie Wiesel's work. Not to diminish what happened.
No.
I just feel like this was the much stronger story. This is the one that stuck with me. This is the one that gave me a perspective about it. That's one of the things Brandon said. He was the co-host who was supposed to be here, but he had to call off at the last moment. Thanks for filling in, by the way,
No
Drew.
problem. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, he was talking about, he was surprised reading this, like the first half of it, how long it took them to get from the Nazis take power to you're in a concentration camp. Where he had always felt from history, because it condenses everything, that like, those two events happened right after another. And
it's not that easy.
This really slow process of like, well, first there's a curfew, and then we're going to like separate you just slightly, and then we're going to make you wear the yellow star, and then like
the ghettos happen.
Yeah,
and
like
then,
you wear the star for a year and you get used to it. Then they're like, we have to move you into this ghetto.
Yeah.
And if you disobey, then they shoot you. And it's like, well, I don't want to get shot. But
so
it's like living in a ghetto
yeah.
is fine. Like, you know, or it's not fine, but it's better than getting shot.
Yes.
And so they're like, it's fine. If we follow their rules, we'll live in the ghetto, but we'll survive. And they don't know it's just leading to something worse. Everyone keeps thinking, surely this is as bad as it gets.
Right.
And then once they get used to it, it adds more. And it takes like 4 or 5 years for this to happen. And it was like a slow build. And yeah, I guess that's the thing, is like, Night just feels like so detached from reality, because it just starts with that horrific event.
Yeah.
So then the final thing I just wanted to bring up, which is not really related to the themes, there's just a quote that I really like. And it's actually from one of the sort of like in-between sections where you're following Art around.
Yeah.
And he talks to his psychiatrist or therapist. One of those two.
Therapist.
I think it's his therapist.
Psychiatrist gives the meds. Therapists help you with the psychological problems.
Okay, yeah. He's talking to his therapist, and his therapist is a Holocaust survivor as well. And he's sort of talking about some of the things that he has trying to adapt Vladek's story and everything.
Right.
And one of the things his therapist says is, life always takes the side of life, and somehow the victims are blamed. But it wasn't the best people that survived, nor the best ones who died. It was random. And he says that in relation to sort of like the survivor's guilt. You know, Art feels bad that his dad went through all this, and all he can do is like tell a story about it. And even Vladek, who survived, like, he has this sort of feeling like, I survived because I'm the best. That's kind of what makes him an asshole.
Right.
Is because he's like, oh yes, because I learned English, and because I learned how to do this, and because I was always saving things, and because I didn't spend my money, and I was doing all this, like, that's why I survived. And that's like, even after out of the camps, he's like finding bits of string on the road.
And like keeping them.
And keeping them, because he's like, why buy new when you can has this? And he actually talks like that. I'm not doing a stereotypical, like, his voice comes through like that. He's like, why buy new nails when you can take old nails out of things that you're not using anymore and put them in jars and sort them and keep them? He's so cheap.
Yeah. But like, again, I think it's, psychologically speaking, for that kind of person to deal with what he dealt with, I think that kind of reaction is natural.
Yeah. And yeah, that's kind of the point, that despite all this heavy stuff that MAUS talks about, it's not trying to have themes about like, this is why he survived.
Yeah.
Like, in the end, he survived because of luck. Because it was random.
Chance.
Yeah, he knew English, and it helped him survive the camps because one of the officers needed to know English, and he kept him from being sent to the gas chambers.
Right.
But it's like, how many people knew English and then got put in a building where there wasn't an officer who needed to use English?
Right.
Like, it was just random. I think that's sort of like a really important message to take away from this. When you're talking about any survivor sort of things. Like, it wasn't that, you know,
they were the strongest or the smartest or the most cunning as it comes to survival. It's, in a situation like this, they will survive whether or not the circumstances allow them to. Yeah,
or I guess the better thing is to flip it around. It wasn't that the victims were weak.
Right.
It wasn't that they weren't the strongest and that's why they didn't survive.
Right.
And I think it's an important lesson to learn, though, not just because of the Holocaust or about survivors, but just in general, life is more random than I think a lot of people give credit for.
Well, a lot of people, and this might be going off topic, but don't want to kind of accept randomness in their life.
Yeah.
And a chance, not in the gambler way, like, you gotta take a chance, kid.
Yeah.
It's more like, people don't like the discomfort of there being reliant on risk.
Yeah.
Because relying on risk means there's no guarantee, and people like guarantees.
Not even guarantees. The thing that this reminds me of is a lot of the people who are like really hardcore, like capitalists, who are, or even like Ayn Randian, like kind of capitalists, who are like, you know, the rich people are rich because they're the most successful. If you're homeless, it's because you didn't work hard enough.
Right.
And the truth of the matter is, a lot of people were born rich. A lot of people do something that gets them so rich, it's impossible for them to fail afterwards. And a lot of people, like, are on the right track, and then they get hit by a car, or their mom gets hit by a car, and they have to take care of her, or something happens completely out of their control.
Again, like, there's so many tales of, like, people who are homeless, or, like, even, drug addicts who, like, they didn't plan on that being their spot in life.
Yeah.
They definitely didn't plan on that. I know several people like that. So,
or not even not even a matter of, like, they didn't plan on it. It's not like they got there because they were dumb.
Yes, exactly.
Because they're like, I have a family member who was, like, a heroin addict for, like, 4 years. Mm-hmm. And now he's a successful businessman who owns his own business.
And
he was the same guy the whole time. It's not like the difference between a drug addict and a businessman is just a mistake.
Yeah.
That he didn't even intend to make.
Yeah, it's a powerful, again, all of this is powerful, fun topics to talk about in a sense of, like, enlightenment.
Yeah, it's good around Christmas time to sort of remember this.
Yeah.
And again, I don't know why that feeling makes me comfortable. The idea that it's like randomness. Maybe it's because I'm not like the greatest in the world or something like that. I don't know. I still feel like I'm pretty successful.
No, like, taking comfort in randomness is a comfortability with you as a person and a place in the universe than most people would give themselves.
I think it's something more along the lines of, if I fail, it's not entirely my fault. And if I succeed, I also shouldn't be prideful because that's not entirely my fault either.
Oh, okay.
I'm perfectly fine being in this middle part where I know I have to work hard to succeed, but I'm also aware that if I work hard and don't succeed, it's not because I'm a failure, necessarily.
Right, no, you failed, but it's accepting that it's not completely on you. Yeah. I get what you mean.
Did you have any other topics that were, like, brought up by this that...
Again, not since high school that I, like, when it was really fresh in my mind.
Yeah.
Because I didn't get a chance to read over it for you lovely folks at home again to remind myself.
Yeah.
But, again, that should speak to the power of this book as a closing statement, that even at high school I still remember bits and pieces, moments of this book. Like,
you still remember
the
enough,
overall
like...
plot, that I, like, can talk about it in this way.
So yeah, this is going to be a shorter episode than normal. But mostly because this is kind of a shorter book, but also just because a lot of the discussion points, because this is a non-fiction book, there's not as much to talk about. It's sort of like more talking about like history a little bit and sort of how you detect it. But I hope you enjoyed it regardless. Thanks again to Bootleg Drew for coming out.
Anytime.
I hope you enjoy it. Comment in the comments if you like him better than CB. It's okay. Brandon doesn't read the comments, so he'll never know who you like better.
Be honest with yourself.
Be honest with yourself. I guess you could throw MBT down there too. He was in one episode. As for the next episode, I'm not exactly sure, but I believe me and Brandon, I'm letting Brandon pick a series.
Okay.
And he found some fantasy series. I think it's called The Live Ship Chronicles.
Oh, that sounds...
And it's about, it's like pirate adventure, but certain ships are like sentient, like magic ships.
I already hate
that you like talk to. And the ship is a character. It's supposed to be really weird and interesting. And like the main characters, they're not pirates, they're like traders and mercantile, or they're merchants and stuff like that. So it's like a very different kind of fantasy story while still being in fantasy.
Eyes. Yeah.
Yeah, Drew squints his eyes. I'm curious to see what this is going to be. Even if it's a train wreck, that'll give us a lot to talk about.
That's fair.
Yeah. I like looking, even bad stories, you can learn 1,000 things from a bad story.
That's true. Again, it's not your successes that you really learn a lot from, it's your failures.
Yeah. Which again, kind of like, there's not as much to talk about with MAUS because it's so good.
Yeah.
Seriously, if you haven't read MAUS, like, go read it. It's great. Best comic ever. And with that, I think we're going to call it. But even though it's late, I want to say happy holidays. Merry Christmas. Happy Hanukkah to those of you.
And Kwanzaa for anyone who celebrates it, all of that jazz.
Does anyone celebrate Kwanzaa anymore?
I mean, if they do, awesome.
Comment in the comments if you celebrate Kwanzaa. I'm curious to hear from you.
But regardless, happy holidays from Hardleg Literature.
Yeah. Imagine if you got drunk on water. This world would be crazy.
This world would be ridiculous. All right, and welcome back.
Just include that randomly.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that MAUS made us think about. What if all the water was booze?